For most of her life, Princess Marguerite of Aurelia had been the family's afterthought, not unloved, never that, but unwatched, in the way second daughters of complicated fathers often are. Her older sister, Princess Odile, had the poise and the profile. Their cousin, the future king, had the destiny. Marguerite had a stammer she'd mostly conquered by 14, a fondness for restoring old furniture, and a father, Prince Frederick, whose name had a way of dragging every conversation about her back to him. The tabloids of Aurelia's capital, Sorbonne, had a nickname for her, the Grey Princess. Not cruel exactly, just dismissive as shorthand for a woman who showed up, smiled, and left before anyone could find a story in her. By 31, the palace correspondents had more or less stopped speculating about her love life. There didn't seem to be one worth the ink. Then, at a charity auction for a children's hospital, she was seated next to a shipping heir named Julian Voss. He was nothing like what the papers would later invent him to be. Not a schemer, not a climber, just a tall, unhurried man who ran his family's ports and refused to discuss his business at parties, which Marguerite found, after a lifetime of men who talked about nothing else, unexpectedly restful. He made her laugh twice in the first 10 minutes, once at his own expense, describing a disastrous attempt to learn to sail a boat his family had owned for 3 generations. She made him miss his next appointment by 40 minutes, then by an hour, and eventually he simply canceled it and didn't tell her until years later. Neither of them noticed the room. A junior aide who'd been assigned to hover near Marguerite that evening later admitted, to no one who mattered, that she'd had to physically remind the princess twice that there was a second course coming and other guests at the table who might like to speak with her. They did not announce anything for a long while. In an age when royal romances were photographed from hedgerows within a week, Marguerite and Julian Voss went 9 months without a single confirmed sighting. Part of this was luck. Julian's work took him to shipping ports rather than nightclubs, and Marguerite had long ago perfected the particular skill, learned from watching her sister's love life get carved up in print, of arriving separately and leaving first. Part of it, too, was simply that neither of them felt any urgency to prove the thing to anyone but themselves. When the truth finally broke via a grainy photo of them walking a dog neither of them owned, which turned out to belong to Julian's sister, the palace press office fielded exactly 1 call before Marguerite herself picked up the phone and confirmed it, calmly, in 4 sentences. Then went back to the restoration project she'd been in the middle of. It was, journalists agreed, the least dramatic royal romance in a decade, which is precisely why no one believed it would stay that way. What the early coverage didn't dwell on, because it wasn't yet a story, was that Julian came with a daughter. 2 years before he met Marguerite, Julian's engagement to a Bergen-based architect named Ingrid Halvorsen had ended amicably by every account that mattered, including Ingrid's own. They had a 5-year-old, Freya, who split her time evenly between 2 households an hour apart, and who liked dinosaurs, the color yellow, and asking exactly 1 more question than anyone had patience for. Marguerite met Freya for the first time at a farmer's market, deliberately chosen by Julian for its total absence of photographers. It went badly for the first 10 minutes. In the ordinary way these things go badly, a child sizing up a stranger, arms crossed, refusing to look up from a stall selling honey, and then Freya asked Marguerite whether princesses were allowed to be scared of thunderstorms. And Marguerite said yes, obviously, all the time, worse than most people in fact, and told her about hiding under a piano as a child during a summer storm. Freya considered this for a long moment, and then asked if Marguerite would like to see her drawing of a triceratops, which she happened to have in her bag, and that was that. The relationship that followed was not instant, and it was not effortless. Julian later admitted to a close friend that the first year involved a great deal of careful choreography, working out which weekends belonged to which household, which school events both parents could attend without it becoming a spectacle, which of Freya's questions about her expanding family deserved a straight answer, and which deserved simply an honest "I don't know yet." But it settled, over time, into something unremarkable in the best sense, a girl with 2 homes and, eventually, 3 adults who all showed up for her sports days. Ingrid Halvorsen, for her part, gave exactly one interview about the arrangement to a small architecture trade magazine that had nothing to do with royal coverage, in which she said she was glad Freya had another adult in her life who took her seriously. It ran without a single sensational line, which meant almost no one read it, which meant the tabloids were free to invent whatever tension they liked in its absence. They did. One paper ran an illustration imagining an icy standoff between the two women at a school gate that had, according to Ingrid's lawyer, simply never taken place. The correction, when it came, ran on page 19, #3. A wedding, twice rewritten. Julian proposed on a ferry crossing between two of Aurelia's coastal islands, an old family ritual, he told her, though she suspected he'd invented the tradition on the spot to have an excuse for the location. He'd hidden the ring inside a battered brass compass that had belonged to his grandfather, the first Voss to run a boat out of Sylvain Harbor, and it took Marguerite a full minute of turning the thing over in her hands, laughing, before she understood what he was actually asking. The palace announced the engagement in the standard measured language of these things. The public, starved of drama for a full year, overcorrected. Front pages ran with headlines like "Shipping Air Nets, His Princess and the Grey Princess Finds Her Color," which Marguerite found more embarrassing than flattering, and which she pinned, eventually, to a corkboard in her office as a kind of private joke. The wedding was meant to be grand. Aurelia's parliament had, with some ceremony, voted a modest public holiday around it, the first for a royal wedding in a generation. 1,200 guests. A processional route through Sylvain's old harbor district, chosen deliberately to pass within sight of the Voss family's original dockyards, a nod Julian's father found more moving than he expected to. Marguerite had picked out 3 separate wedding dresses before settling on one that had belonged to a great-aunt, altered by the same seamstress who'd been quietly dressing the family for 40 years, and let herself, for a few months, enjoy something she rarely allowed herself, the simple anticipation of a good day, uncomplicated by anyone else's story. Then, 10 weeks before the date, Prince Frederick's decades of financial entanglements with a disgraced offshore fund finally caught up with him in the worst possible way, not through rumor this time, but through a leaked parliamentary inquiry naming him, specifically, as having personally profited from a scheme that had defrauded several public pension funds. It was the kind of scandal that doesn't produce a single bad week, it produces a bad year, then a bad decade. Marguerite learned about it the same way most of the country did, from a news alert on her phone, 20 minutes before her father called to tell her himself, apologizing not for what he'd done. He never quite managed that, but for the timing of it landing on her. Aurelia's government, mindful of appearances, quietly suggested the wedding be scaled back. The palace didn't argue. What had been planned as a 1,200 guest procession through Sylvain became, in the space of 6 weeks, a ceremony for 40 people in the palace's private chapel, live-streamed to no one, photographed by a single approved photographer whose images were released only after the fact. Marguerite wore the same great-aunt's dress. There had been no time, and by then, no appetite, to commission anything new. Her father did not walk her down the aisle, not because he was barred exactly, but because both of them, independently and without discussing it, understood that his presence beside her on camera would turn her wedding day into a footnote in his scandal rather than the reverse. He watched from a back pew instead, and Julian's own father, a quiet widower who had never much cared for ceremony, walked her the last few steps in his place, an arrangement nobody planned in advance, and everybody in the room understood without being told why. It was, by any honest account, a strange way to begin a marriage, a woman marrying the first genuinely calm man she'd found, on the smallest possible version of a day meant to be the biggest of her life, because of decisions her father had made years before she was born. Guests who were there later described it, privately, as one of the more moving weddings they'd attended precisely because of how little pretense was left in it once the guest list had been cut to the bone, no politics to manage. No distant cousins to seat diplomatically, just the people who actually wanted to be there. For Julian, the 6 months after the wedding were an education in a kind of scrutiny he hadn't priced in. Voss Maritime had been a solid, unglamorous, mid-sized shipping firm for 3 generations, profitable, privately held, entirely uninteresting to anyone outside the industry. Overnight, it became a subject of parliamentary questions. Opposition politicians who had never once mentioned Voss Maritime in a decade of debates suddenly wanted to know whether any of its port contracts touched state business. They didn't. An independent audit, commissioned mostly to make the noise stop, confirmed as much within 2 months, but by then, the audit's clean result made far fewer headlines than the original questions had. A cabinet minister who'd raised the issue in the chamber never once returned to correct the record. Once the audit came back, Julian noted this, filed it away, and said nothing about it publicly, which his own lawyers found more frustrating than reassuring. Julian's response, which several commentators found either admirably stubborn or faintly suspicious depending on their priors, was to keep running the company exactly as before. He didn't step back from the business, didn't hire a publicist, didn't give interviews explaining himself. He showed up to work at the same hour he always had, took the same ferry to the same dockyard office his grandfather had used, and let the audit speak for itself. Employees who'd worked under him for years later said the only visible change was that he stopped answering his direct line himself for a period, routing calls through an assistant simply because so many of them turned out to be journalists. The tabloids, deprived of an actual scandal, turned instead to Freya's 2 households, hunting for friction between Marguerite and Ingrid that neither woman would supply. One particularly inventive weekly ran a story claiming the 2 women had clashed over a school selection. Sourced to a friend of a friend, Ingrid's lawyer sent a single, quiet letter, and the story was never repeated. Another outlet, further down the credibility ladder, ran a piece speculating that Julian resented having married into a family that couldn't stop generating headlines about someone else's misconduct. No one who actually knew him gave the story any weight, and it died within a news cycle, but it captured something true about the strange position he'd landed in, regardless, a man whose own record was clean. Absorbing suspicion generated entirely by people he hadn't chosen and couldn't control. Underneath the tabloid noise, something more structural was happening inside the Aurelian court, and it had nothing to do with Marguerite's marriage at all. King Alaric, Marguerite's uncle, and a monarch openly preoccupied with the monarchy's cost to the public purse, had spent 3 years quietly trimming the number of family members, drawing on the civil list, folding minor patronages into fewer hands, and pushing more of the family toward ordinary careers. It was a project he'd inherited in spirit from his own mother, the old queen, who had grumbled for decades about a family tree with more branches than the treasury could reasonably fund. But it fell to Alaric to actually do the trimming, and he did it with the brisk, faintly apologetic efficiency of a man doing a job he found distasteful but necessary. Marguerite, whose father's disgrace made her an obvious candidate for the cut, had in fact volunteered for it years earlier, taking a full-time role restoring historic properties for a heritage trust rather than accepting a public stipend. It meant she'd never been financially dependent on the crown's goodwill in the way some of her cousins were, a fact that made her, paradoxically, one of the more secure people in a shrinking institution. Even as newspapers wrote about her as if she'd been pushed to the margins, she still turned up for the ceremonial occasions that mattered: the state funerals, the coronations, the odd wartime remembrance, but she did so as a guest of the institution rather than an employee of it, a distinction that meant almost nothing to the public and almost everything to her. Julian, watching this unfold from the outside, later told a friend a remark that made its way, eventually and without his consent, into a magazine profile that he'd married into a family actively deciding who it had room for, and that he'd been relieved, not troubled, to learn his wife had already decided the answer for herself years before he arrived. What struck him more, he added, was how little any of it seemed to cost her in private. She spoke about the Heritage Trust with more enthusiasm than she'd ever shown for a single royal engagement, restoring a crumbling 17th century granary in the countryside north of Sylvain with the same patient attention she brought to everything else in her life. In the couple's third year of marriage, Marguerite went into labor 8 weeks early. There had been no warning worth the name. A routine scan 2 days earlier had flagged nothing beyond mild concern, and the speed of it left no time for the careful, managed announcements the palace usually issued in advance of these things. Julian was in a board meeting 11 minutes from the hospital. When the call came, he made it in 6, leaving his car running and half-blocking a loading dock outside the maternity entrance. A detail the hospital's security staff found funny enough to mention months later to absolutely no one who mattered. Their son, whom they would name Theo, spent his first 17 days in a neonatal unit, most of them in an incubator. All of them without a single photograph released, without a single statement beyond the barest confirmation that a child had been born and that the family asked for privacy. Palace watchers, so used to a steady diet of content, found the silence almost unbearable. To sit with one commentator wrote, not unkindly, that it was the first time in years the royal family had gone quiet, not out of strategy, but out of simple fear. A few outlets tried, in the vacuum, to speculate about the couple's state of mind, running pieces about mounting strain, but even the most opportunistic royal correspondents largely held back this time. There is a point past which even a hungry press corps recognizes it is looking at something that isn't theirs to narrate. What actually happened in that hospital, neither Marguerite nor Julian ever fully described in public, beyond a single line each gave, months later, to a children's charity newsletter, thanking the neonatal staff by name. But those close to the family friends, not sources. And there is a difference, described a couple who did not leave the hospital in shifts to preserve appearances, who sat together through the worst nights rather than performing composure for each other, who argued once, badly, over something neither of them could later remember, and made up within the hour because there wasn't room in that week for anything less urgent than their son. Freya, kept mostly at Ingrid's during the worst of it, was brought in for a single supervised visit in week 2, allowed to press her small hand against the incubator glass for exactly as long as the nurses judged wise, and came out the other side of it, by every account, more attached to her new brother than either parent had expected a 9-year-old to be capable of on one visit. Here is the plain accounting. Once the noise falls away, the marriage had, in 3 years, absorbed a father's financial disgrace that arrived with brutal timing, a parliamentary inquiry into a business that had done nothing wrong, invented tension with a former partner that never existed, a monarchy visibly narrowing around them, and a genuine medical emergency with their newborn son. Any one of these is enough to strain most marriages badly. None of them, on the visible evidence, strained this one at all. What the tabloids had actually been reacting to across 3 years of speculation was not evidence of a marriage in trouble, but the simple fact that Marguerite and Julian declined to perform their difficulties for public consumption. They gave no exclusive interviews about how they got through it. They released no carefully staged reconciliation photos because there had been no rupture to reconcile from. A parliamentary aide who worked adjacent to the family for years put it to a colleague privately, in words that later leaked, "They're not hiding a divorce. They're just not selling us their marriage." There is, of course, a kind of story that thrives specifically in that silence. A wedding cut down to 40 guests reads, if you want it to, as a marriage starting under a curse. A businessman who keeps his head down reads, if you squint, as a man with something to hide. A stepmother and a former partner who simply get along read, to an editor short on copy, as a rivalry waiting to surface. None of these readings required a single fact to survive. They required only that the couple stay quiet long enough for someone else to fill the silence on their behalf, and for 3 years, that is precisely what happened, cycle after cycle, with no actual evidence ever produced, because there was none to find. The Grey Princess, it turned out, had simply never needed the spotlight to know what she had, and the man who married in had never needed the crown to know who he was. Between them, in a family whose public story was almost always a story of things falling apart, they had built, without any apparent effort to be noticed for it, one of the only marriages in a generation that nobody could find a genuine crack in, because there wasn't one to find. Theo came home from the hospital on a quiet Tuesday, in a car with no palace markings, to a house with no photographers outside it. Freya, 9 by then, had made him a card with a dinosaur on it, carefully lettered, that read simply welcome. "You're my favorite baby so far," a joke Julian repeated for years afterward, to Theo's mounting embarrassment.